Hello everyone, this is Nevernan, and today we will be doing a very controversial video as it will be finally time to talk about the big elephant in the room in the Monotype scene right now, Gliscor. So, Gliscor, as many of you who play Monotype know, is currently being suspect tested, but even before it's suspect tested, it's always been the ire of everyone who has played this metagame for a relatively long amount of time. And there were more concerning things to ban at the start of the metagame, that is true. And typically, mons like Gliscor aren't really like knee-jerk banned or looked into that much because everyone gets frustrated with defensive Pokemon every once and again. But Gliscor is a little unique. And we'll get into the posts later, but first I just want to talk about the Pokemon we are talking about, just for history's sake. So, these are just the sets on flying, by the way. When I talk about Gliscor, it's going to be mainly its presence on flying. On ground is very much a healthy Pokemon. I will say that right now. It is very healthy, and I don't think it would need to. I don't think anything it does on ground necessarily needs to be addressed or looked at. Its presence on ground, in my opinion, it does not matter at all for this discussion, since it is not super meta on ground, and even so, Sandless is still like not that oppressive when in its good matchups, and Gliscor just does not have the support it needs to be as unbearable as it is on flying. So when I talk about the mon, I'm purely talking about its presence on flying. I might bring up ground once or twice, just to mention a few things, but for the most part, we're talking about flying. Anyway, first things first. So the first set we have here is the Subtoxic set, which is a standard, especially defensive set, bunch of HP, and you basically spam Substitute and Protect. The goal of this set this is probably one of the most frustrating sets to face up against, but there's more. But yeah, it's a fairly good defensive mon. It can tank a lot of hits, and you just spam. If your team doesn't have a Toxic switch in, like a Steel type or a Poison type, this thing will wear you down. So imagine, if you will, if you're going up against Gliscor as like a defensive water team, or even like a fighting team, for example. If you don't switch in the Sneasler or Toxapex into Gliscor's Toxic, every single one of your other Pokemon are going to get completely annihilated. Well, not annihilated, but chipped down significantly by Gliscor and its stally tactics. Now, it isn't impossible to break through this set. However, it is extremely hard to get to break through it, since it has Protect, it has the ability to Scout, and it has the ability to just switch out to one of its good teammates, being either the regenerating Tornadus Therian or the defensive steals in Skarmory or Corviknight. So it's very difficult for there to be any progress made against Gliscor, and if it gets any free turns whatsoever, it will just get a fourth of its HP back with the Protect and Toxic Orb combo, so yes, this is one of the more frustrating sets. It just slowly whittles away your team, and sadly, the poison types that would switch into Toxic get hit by Earthquake super effectively, so you can't even really do that. This set does get walled by the Flying Steels that I mentioned before, Corviknight and Skarmory, and some Steel types can just take the Earthquakes relatively well and set up in front of it. But for the most part, it is very difficult for Gliscor, for teams that are unprepared for a set like this, to deal with it. Due to Gliscor's tankiness and the fact that you can't Toxic it because it benefits from it. You can't status it at all, actually, because it's got a Toxic Orb on constantly. Knockoff doesn't really do anything to hinder it. And again, its defensive typing is really good. Ground Flying has been a very good defensive typing for a while. Its biggest weakness is the Ice-type moves that it has to be afraid of, but once again, Gliscor has access to plenty of teammates that can very easily take those Ice-type attacks. Like the aforementioned, again, Corviknight and Skarmory. Corviknight for the specialized attacks, and Skarmory for the physicalized attacks. You can even go into Articuno or even Moltres if you want. But yeah, it has a ton of options for teammates that can just cover its Ice weakness. And for the water weakness, you have Dragonite and Gyarados as well. And you don't even really need to use them for that because it's not even... Most water moves aren't really even going to eliminate Gliscor like that. At least from common attackers. But yeah. Gliscor, this Gliscor set is very frustrating. That is definitely one of the key things. But it's not the most frustrating set. We'll get there. But next we'll go into the physically defensive set. So this physically defensive set goes a different direction. Instead of relying on Toxic and slowly whittling down your team, it instead focuses on just being excuse me, very annoying, just a big blob that kind of sits in front of your team and just doesn't really do much. It sets up rocks, it knocks off items from anyone on the enemy team, and Earthquake once again is just good stat to have. Now, this set is annoying for a different reason. Now, it doesn't really matter if you're especially defensive or physically defensive. It's physically defensive on this set, and it is a viable option, but it should be mentioned that the reason why this set is very frustrating is because, if you notice, Stealth Rock and Knockoff both share 32 PP. Now, this is bad for a couple of reasons, because one of the things that you typically want to do against a defensive Pokemon is you want to wear down their recovery move that they have. You want to like force them to use all of their roosts, all their recovers, all their slack-offs. You want to basically burn through that, and Game Freak has made it so that strategies like this so that doing that is a lot easier due to the nerf that they did to recovery moves in this generation. Even Rest got hit, even though I don't think Rest needed to get hit, but even Rest got hit by it. So it's a lot easier to play around those types of moves because of that nerf, and it makes dealing with defensive Pokemon overall a lot easier. However, Gliscor lost Roost, so now it can't even use that. So it's forced to do this playstyle instead, where it just kind of sits on your team and then just scouts for a move and then swaps out. And because it can do that, and because it's so hard for a lot of types to break through this thing, especially after being worn down by the rest of Gliscor's teammates, it ends up just becoming a massive issue, and it just outlasts everything. And it has 32 PP on both Knockoff and Stealth Rock, so wearing down its PP is not going to do much for it. And it's not like you can wear down its recovery, because its recovery is passive. Quite literally. So yeah, and it's not like you can knock off the Toxic Orb level 1 or turn 1, because that would require you to either read the Gliscor switching into a Ice-type move from one of your mons. So, for example, a Weavile on Dark could potentially go for a knockoff against Gliscor when it's threatening a strong Ice-type attack on something. Oh, sorry, I messed up the things, but yeah, we can just imagine, I don't think Pawmont gets knockoff, but imagine, if you will, if Pawmont got knockoff. It tries to bait with an electric move and instead uses knockoff on Gliscor. That'd probably be one of the few times you can do it, but as I mentioned before, Gliscor has plenty of teammates that can help that, and a lot of people on flying teams, just lead with Gliscor just to get the Toxic Orb ready to go. So they don't really risk it anyway. And if you do risk it, you kind of just end up losing, because a lot of people are going to rather get rid of the Toxic Orb than have to deal with it. So yeah, there's really no way to really get Toxic Orb off of Gliscor before it procs Poison Heal effectively. The best way you can mess up Poison Heal, specifically, and this goes for all the sets, not just this set, but the most realistic way to do it is to use either Neutralizing Gas on Galarian Weezing, or you suppress its ability with one of the couple of move suppressing or ability suppressive moves that exist in the game. So Worry Seed, I think there's another one. There's Entrainment as well. And yeah, there's a couple of them that you can use, but obviously these are not super viable and easy to fit on a team. So yeah, it can be very annoying, and even then, these ability switching moves just wear off the second Gliscor switches out, so the good news is that toxic orb damage does still rack up on Gliscor when this happens, so if Gliscor is just sitting there for a really long time, and the toxic orb damage is like up to like 48 or 54%, for example, you can just go ahead and like you can just use the move, and then Gliscor just loses like 54% of his HP, and it can't get that back until they switch out, which that could be good, especially with Stealth Rock Chip. So it's not completely out of the picture, but still very obnoxious. Very, very obnoxious. But yeah, with that mini rant out of the way, this set specifically is just good at doing that. Doing what I just said. It just sits in front of your team and it doesn't really do much. It scouts, it sets up rocks. The rocks could also be spikes too if you have like a rock Skarmory. So yeah, and it can very easily do this. It can just easily come in and just do this. Press protect, click knockoff. It just makes way too much progress, and it doesn't really get, like, worn down as easily as you would wish, because the rocks get offset immediately by Toxic Orb's healing. So it's just very... This set is also very frustrating because it's hard to wear out with PP stalling. So pressure mons like Suicune and a couple of other ones. I'm trying to think of any other pressure mons that exist, but... Any sort of pressure mon that would normally try to stall out, Corviknight actually is a good one. Corviknight would try and stall Gliscor out, but it can't really do that because Knockoff and Stealth Rock just have so much PP. But yeah, that's it for that set. Now for the set that causes the most problems. This is I think this is one of the biggest reasons why Gliscor is as frustrating as it is, because the existence of this set specifically makes it far too difficult to truly prepare for Gliscor in the builder effectively. Because if you have an answer to defensive Gliscor, but you don't have an answer to offensive Gliscor, that is a massive problem, because this set is, once again, a set that avoids the issues of most setup sweepers, at least when it comes to getting burnt. So, because this set can't get burnt, and this is usually a trait shared by a lot of fire types, and you'll notice that a lot of physical fire types are typically like either super giga broken, like Cinderace was in Gen 8, or they're significantly nerfed in their attack stat, and that's usually why, because they can't get burnt. Intimidate does exist for them, but yeah, their lack of ability to get burnt is actually a reason why fire type physical attackers are typically kept in check by Game Freak intentionally, and when they don't do that, well, we've seen what Cinderace did in Gen 8, so yeah. But with that out of the way, Gliscor shares this trait, except it's not a fire type. It is instead using Toxic Orb to not be able to get burnt, and that allows it to use Facade and not have to worry about getting worn down either. Because unlike other Facade users, like Diggersby in previous generations, for example. Wait, why did I say Diggersby? Not Diggersby. Who else am I thinking of? We'll just say Conkeldurr, because I can't really come up with a really good example, but, you know, the normal Facade users. Yeah, Conkeldurr would have a Burn Orb on it, and also use Facade, but you would still have the Burn Orb on you. Oh, I completely forgot about Ursaluna. Yeah, Ursaluna is a good example. But yeah, Ursaluna would have to suffer from burn damage in order to use its full power Facade, and it would get slowly worn down. This is a big issue with the mon in general. Gliscor doesn't have that problem. It actually heals from its status, so it doesn't have to worry about that at all. And it still gets the benefits of a 140 base power Facade. So this is actually very annoying, because it makes it so that this set is harder to deal with, and intimidating this mon isn't easy either, because it has Sword Stance, and that just makes it a lot easier for it to set up and ignore those boosts. Because remember, it's still a really good defensive Pokemon, even with this setup. It's not even set up offensively, it's still set up defensively. But this set can still sweep your team. And this set is, I believe, the biggest problem with the mon. Because now, not only do you have to worry about a defensive Pokemon just completely walling your team, now you have to make sure that you can actually defeat that defensive Pokemon and make sure that it doesn't sweep your entire team. Because there are ways to answer defensive bonds, but those same answers aren't going to be equipped to handle offensive setups. So yeah, Gliscor, this particular Gliscor set is definitely one of the biggest reasons why the mod is super frustrating. Because imagine you're trying to prepare for, or you're expecting a set like this, the physical defense utility set, or the subtoxic set, you click taunt on it, and instead of your taunting mon not getting hit by anything, and instead it gets hit with a 140 base power facade. Now, you do disable it from using Sword Stance, but now you have to deal with those super strong facades and the earthquakes, while it's still healing itself. So yeah, Taunt just feels like it doesn't do enough against all of its sets, and this set is one of the reasons why. But yeah, this is definitely one of the most frustrating sets, and now we have the last set. This is just a mixture of the physical defense set and the toxic set. It tries to do a mix of both worlds. I wouldn't say these sets are really that good, but I have seen them used, and these have been used in MPL and MWP before, so it's not like these sets are like completely unviable. But this is just kind of trying to mix everything together. It's a hybrid set, so it has the toxic, it has the stealth rock, and it has the mono earthquake. I've seen more mono knockoffs in my time though, so yeah, I think replace this earthquake with knockoff, and I'd say this is probably what I see ran on a lot of tournament teams. But yeah, those are the sets we are talking about. So if you'll notice a common trend with all these sets, they all abuse Toxic Orb and Poison Heals combination extremely well. The wall sets make it so that it can't get worn down from normal means, like stalling out its healing move, or stalling out its healing whatsoever, or stopping its healing. It just cannot be done on those sets because of this combination. And Sword Stance takes advantage of the facade boost and not being able to get burnt due to it being poisoned. So we have on our hands a potential mon that could essentially either wall your entire team or sweep your entire team. Because normal ground is actually not that bad of coverage for an offensive Pokemon, because it basically hits almost everything except for Flying Steels super effective, or somewhat decently. Flying Steels are the only thing that stopped this set, and yeah, Skarmory definitely does wall the Sword Stance facade set, but Skarmory will not like getting knocked off by the defensive sets is the issue. So if you send in your Skarmory thinking that, oh, this is definitely the Sword Stance set, and you get hit with a knockoff and you lose your Rocky Helmet, well, that just sucks, because now your Skarmory is significantly less useful in the match. Especially since Gliscor is on a flying team, and that flying team is probably going to have a U-turning Tornadus Therian, which you definitely want to get as much chip on as possible. So yeah, U-turning Tornadus Therian and a U-turning Corviknight as well. So yeah, your Skarmory is not going to enjoy getting their helmet knocked off very much. And that applies to a lot of other walls as well. So Steel has to be careful against this mon as well, because this set can just completely wreck their team. But it also has to be careful with the defensive sets, because defensive sets can just stack hazards and make it really hard for Steel to do their job, and also outstall them. Because Steel is notably a type that does not have a lot of mons with consistent recovery. Skarmory and Corviknight are like the only mons like that because, well, they're flying types, so they have access to Roost. But yeah, generally Steel is a type that's not really associated with having high recovery moves. And if you look at Steel teams in general, it's usually just Skarmory or Corviknight that has the healing move, and sometimes Empoleon if it shows up. But yeah, generally Steel types don't have recovery. Archaludon, perfect example of that. But, you know, so being worn down like this by a mon like this just makes it harder for Steel to play, and it also makes it hard for Water to play. Gliscor's effect against Water teams specifically is incredibly devious, since it can stack Spikes, it can stack Stealth Rock, it can Toxic any of your walls, so it can just Toxic your Alomomola, for example, or your Alomomola could just get knocked off. Or your team can get swept because you decided that you were going to swap out your Toxapex in front of the Gliscor so it could keep its heavy-duty boots, only for the Gliscor to decide that they're going to read that and Swords Dance in front of your face. Now, your Toxapex cannot come in anymore, because it is going to be in constant threat of getting 2-hit KO'd by the Earthquake. So, yeah, that is where we are with Gliscor right now. And as we will now see, there are a couple of posts that were made about this mod that I wanted to highlight. So this one that I saw from AAA How Do Game Work is... I won't read the entire post, since you can read it for yourself if you want. But essentially, a TLDR for this post is that Gliscor very much avoids standard counterplay for defensive Pokemon. And it goes out and points out how every single type of defensive Pokemon has some sort of weakness. I have Regenerator mons, how Regenerator mons are usually affected by stacking hazards, or how Unaware mons can be worn down by Volturn cores or by hazards as well. And if you think about it, he's very much right. A lot of defensive Pokemon have like a key flaw that keeps them very much in line, and these key flaws are what separates a broken defensive Pokemon from a regular, just really good defensive Pokemon. A good defensive Pokemon is Skarmory. Skarmory has been around forever and has been doing the same thing forever. It sets its rocks, it's very physically bulky, and it has its roost. It can heal up whenever it needs to, but Skarmory cannot be a huge physical threat. It has to trade off something for that. And Skarmory can get taunted. If Skarmory gets taunted, it's basically useless because its offensive prowess is not really that great. And yeah, it wants to keep its roost as well, so Skarmory will get forced out by taunt. Gliscor, on the other hand, as we mentioned before, when it gets taunted, it doesn't lose out on that much. It doesn't lose access to its healing, because Poison Heal will just go off passively. And even if it stops the Sword Stance, it's still going to benefit from its facade being boosted. Now, granted, this is a hat in the air argument, and it's not really like a super big argument for a Gliscor's ban, but I will say that the SD sets still don't get as punished as you would want from taunt as you would like. Even though it is mainly running defensive, so it isn't as powerful as it could be, but it's still the fact that it has those moves and can still put out that pressure is still... it's still unideal, I would say, and it still also is healing at the same time. But yeah. And another counterplay for some defensive Pokemon would be Bander Specs Pokemon, as he mentions as well. Those are typically beaten by choiced... these defensive Pokemon are like super bulky, so you got your Alolan Mux, for example, and your, not really a Alomobola, but your Chansey? I wouldn't say Chansey, your Caledons and Hisuian Gujas, actually, that's a better example. Those stalwart defensive Pokemon with no, like, consistent recovery, they can just get broken through by Bander Specs Pokemon, they kind of just have to deal with it. The issue with Gliscor is that it has access to Protect, and it can just switch out from those very easily. Now, it's not to say that those other Pokemon don't also have access to Protect. Obviously, every single Pokemon, well, most Pokemon have access to Protect. But what separates Gliscor from these mons is that they have to give up something in order to keep Protect. Heatran is a good example, since Heatran does run Protect sometimes, but it's usually giving up one of its other really impactful moves that it might need. If you use Protect, you either have to give up Power Gem / Stone Edge to deal with Volcarona, you have to give up either a Hazard or maybe even your Steel Stab as well, just so you can fit Protect on there and have the immense power that the Scouting gives you. But Heatran does have to choose what it wants when it does that, but Gliscor doesn't really have to choose that much, since its strategy is just inherently tied to using Protect. Protect is just way too good on Gliscor specifically, and that in combination with its auto-healing just makes it really difficult for anyone to deal with, because remember, its healing is better than any other type of passive healing that walls typically get in this game. Because most walls have to rely on Leftovers or Black Sludge, which only heals for 6% of their health, while Gliscor gets to heal for 12. This is obviously absurd. So, and on top of all this, Gliscor's item can be removed at any time, and it just doesn't matter. Like, 90% of the time, if you knock off Gliscor's Toxic Orb, it doesn't really matter. You're actually losing if you knock it off. Because if you wait to knock it off, it's actually better, because you'll get a higher powered knockoff on the one turn if it's even potentially low. That'll allow you to break through it in a couple of clutch scenarios. But most of the time, that's not going to happen, because if you're pressing knockoff against flying, you want to make some progress. And this is one of the biggest issues with Gliscor as well, is that it basically makes it so that a defensive team doesn't have to fear knockoff whatsoever. And that is absurd, because usually most Pokemon that have an item that can't get knocked off are usually using items that they're forced to use. So stuff like Ogerpon, for example, is forced to use Corner Mask, and the Megas in previous generations, for example, are forced to have their Mega Stones. They don't have the luxury of just having another item. They're forced to use that item that may or may not even be that good for them. But Gliscor can just use Toxic Orb and then afford to get it knocked off and not really care and still get all the benefits that came from using that item. It's kind of unfair. From a design perspective, it's very unfair for a lot of defensive Pokemon. Because even Mega Sableye, at its worst, had the audacity to at least still have its Recover and or its boosting sets. And even though it fundamentally ignored Taunt as well, similarly to Gliscor, actually way better than Gliscor, it fundamentally didn't have to worry about Taunt, it didn't have to worry about a lot of other stuff, but it still had to manage its health relatively well and make sure it didn't get too low, because clicking Protect would only do so much for it. But Gliscor doesn't have that problem because, again, its healing is passive. There are even some people who used Molt Breaker Tredegon, I believe, back then, to just use Toxic on Sableye so that it couldn't ignore it with Magic Bouts. And obviously that wasn't super healthy, and that's why Sableye got banned in ORS, but it stayed in SM and on. But yeah, no, the fact that Mega Sableye was still able to be affected by that in some sort of way, but Gliscor just doesn't even have that as an option, that is definitely one of the bigger concerns for why this mon is so strong. And I know I'm harping a lot on this post specifically, but this post really does just specifically talk about why, as a wall, Gliscor is just out there. And this isn't even to mention the fact that Gliscor can also just be offensive at any point with its Sword Stance set. So, yeah. Now, he mentioned a lot about Stall Water and how it affects that, but this just applies to most types, I would say. Because, as I mentioned before, Poison has to worry about, and Pengarzan, one of the best Poison users in Monotype, is constantly talking about how Poison just can't do what it wants to do because Gliscor basically forces it into very specific playstyles. And if one Mon can have that much restriction on the builder for a team or for a type, that's pretty bad. Because Poison is actually a really fun and viable type. We've seen how it can do in NPL when it doesn't get matched up against Gliscor. So the fact that it's basically almost an auto-lose against Gliscor really goes to show that the Mon is absurd because it has access to Earthquake, and Poison is typically a type that doesn't struggle a ton against walls because it has access to Toxic, obviously. And they can stack hazards really well, and they have access to a lot of mons with Regenerator. so they don't get worn down very easily, but Gliscor just kind of is a ground type that flies and ignores their hazards, and doesn't care about their knockoff or their toxic, and that is definitely concerning. Now that's just poison, but poison should have a better deal against a wall of that nature compared to other types, so imagine how the other types feel. Now they may not be weak to earthquake, but stuff like water has a hard time dealing with it, even though they have a type advantage against it. And while ice is definitely not really one of the best used types right now, or one of the best types right now, even it will still not like having to deal with Gliscor and its constant scouting, because it'll just make it harder for them to get in their breakers and their physical or special attackers. Because, for example, you put in your Alola Ninetales to set up your Hail, Gliscor just clicks Protect. If you swap out, the Protect fails, and it basically gets to use it again, so you just waste another turn of Hail. And Gliscor can just heal its HP back up. And then, after it scouts your move, now it swaps into either Corviknight or Articuno, and now the Ice user is forced to either make a hard prediction, or they have to keep playing Gliscor's game, and during all that they're losing their Hail, and yeah, that's just unpleasant. So Gliscor is just very obnoxious to deal with, and being obnoxious isn't bad, but like I said, it ignores a lot of the weaknesses that a lot of defensive Pokemon have, and as I said before, defensive walls are typically not banned a lot in Mons in general because they have a very important role to serve in the metagame. Because it stops it from being like a constant sackfest, and as most people have said before, Mons is best played when it is mainly a bounce-based tier. Some offense is fine, but generally when bounce is a very viable archetype, that is when Mons is at its best. So, Gliscor just being able to basically constrict most bulky teams because of these I would say cheat codes, not really super cheat codes, but for lack of a better term, cheat codes in the way that it operates as a wall, it kinda makes it bad. And it's funny, because if it still had Roost, it would actually be fine. It actually might still be fine, because it wouldn't be able to fit in Knockoff and a Hazard and all of that all in one set, because it would still be forced to use Roost. And then Taunt would be more effective on it, but as we see now, this is not an option for it, so yeah, this begs the question of whether or not that would have been busted in previous generations, but that's a topic for another day. Another post I wanted to highlight here is the Wyvern King's vote, her opinion, talking a lot about how flying would be a little bit more honest. Now, I thought this point was interesting, because flying does get a lot of types of Monotype are not inherently honest. Like Fire, for example, is a very dishonest type, I would say, because it kind of just gets away with doing a lot of nonsense. Dragon is like a semi-dishonest type, because its two Steel Mons are very strong. And, yeah. You could go on for, like, how a lot of types are dishonest, but I would definitely say that, I think instead of saying dishonest or honest, I would say carried would be a better term for talking about Gliscor, because Gliscor kind of just acts as like a very big crutch, or it just hard carries the entirety of flying, to the point where it's like, flying still has a lot of type or build variety, right? Like, a lot of mods are still viable in flying, and there's a lot of different archetypes you can use, but Gliscor kind of makes some of those archetypes work when they realistically shouldn't, in my opinion, and that is definitely a cause for issue, I would say. But yeah, I just wanted to bring this one up because this is an interesting point that was brought up. Alright, I already talked about this post, and so we're going to go into this post, which is the last post I will cover, because this post talks about the other end of the spectrum as to why it shouldn't be banned. Now, Tough here talks about how we should not base it on frustration, which, yes, we have talked about this before. Defensive Pokemon are always brought up for ban discussions because they're inherently frustrating to play against, but as has been stated here and in many times in the past, defensive Pokemon are important for the game in general. They're a necessary evil, to be specific. But yes, it being very... The argument that Tough Stuff makes here is the general argument that most walls in Monotype, or not even Monotype, but in competitive bonds has, is that it being hard to break, forcing preparation, or creating slower games are valid observations, but it does not mean it is broken or uncompetitive. This is true. This is a good point. However, the other side of this is that it is just way too good. It is just way too good at its job, and it has way too many cheats as a wall, as I mentioned before, and how in How Do Game Works post, I need to come up with a better name for him, but in their post, in How Do Game Works post, you have to take into account that as a wall, Gliscor just does way too much and doesn't have enough of a weakness. Because even though it is quad weak to ice, it's still living some of those ice hits. Like, we've seen it happen in MPL and MWP, where it just lived an ice hit from full, and it was able to just protect and heal its HP, 25% of its HP, swap out, and basically be fine. Well, not basically be fine, it would still be low for the rest of the game, but it could still make progress happen in that turn that it's getting hit, and that's ridiculous. So, yeah, definitely concerning. Now, I said this before on the survey for Monotype after NPL. I personally think that Gliscor is a necessary evil, but I'm not opposed to it getting banned, because I've known this for a while, because I've had to play against Gliscor a lot on the ladder, so I know how obnoxious this thing is to deal with, especially with the higher ladder players that use it. But yeah, Gliscor, very obnoxious Pokemon to use, but I don't think it is super broken. I know a lot of people are saying that you shouldn't bring up the stats from MPL because it's not a really good representation or significant indicator of how good the Mon is. And that is true, because Dragon has a bad win rate in MPL 12, but... MPL 12, I need to make sure, see if MPL 12 is actually right, but yeah, in MPL, it wasn't used, or it was used a lot, but Flying had a low win rate. But that doesn't really mean that Flying is bad, it just means people were prepping for Flying really well because they knew how strong Gliscor was, and how strong the Flying cores were. And if you see those matches, a lot of those teams just have tech specifically for Flying teams, and breaking through them. That's not to say that it's healthy, though, because a lot of the sets would be unconventional otherwise if it were not for Gliscor's presence. So, yeah, I definitely think that Gliscor is definitely concerning because of how good it is and how versatile it is. Because we just talk about a lot of its defensive qualities, but the offensive variant is very obnoxious to have to deal with as well. And like I said, I think the offensive variant is probably the reason why Gliscor is as obnoxious and as frustrating as it is. If it wasn't able to run its offensive set as well as it could, I think the Mon would be a lot more tolerable and a lot easier to deal with, since it would just be another defensive Pokemon. Granted, a very strong defensive Pokemon, but another defensive Pokemon. But yeah, unfortunately, that is not the world we live in, and it can still run its offensive set, while still being a very good wall. So, yep, that is just how I am. But yeah, my total verdict on this entire matter, if you want to care for my opinion, is that Gliscor is a necessary evil. I would not be opposed to it getting banned, but I myself will not be voting ban or do not ban. I'm not going to participate in the suspect at all. Mainly because it's very hard for me to get Rex, and I'm a little too busy for that at the moment. But yeah, I generally do think that Gliscor is typically a mon that I find myself being able to deal with a lot, but I definitely do see the argument for how bad it is. So, how bad it is for the metagame, that is. So, yeah. With all that in mind, I hope you guys enjoyed this little video. This is very different from what I usually do, because I don't usually do coverages like this. I was thinking about doing a bigger video for this, but I think that a discussion format like this is a lot better, since it better allows me to convey my points a lot easier, and I don't have to do as much a mishmash with gathering data and all of that. I can just show you everything and just explain it very quickly. You know this video is pretty long, but yeah, Gliscor, definitely concerning mon. I definitely agree that it is a little strong, but I personally think that something needs to be done about the double steel core. That on Dragon, that to me is more concerning than Gliscor at the moment, but I definitely am not going to be opposed to it getting banned. I'm not against it, but I'm not for it either, if that makes sense. I have a perfectly neutral stance on the mon. I felt the highs and the lows with this mon, and I definitely am fine with either or happening. If it stays, I'm fine with it. If it goes, not exactly displeased or very upset. It may come off as me like not super caring, but I do care about what happens to this mon because it will affect everything in the metagame. Because this mon is very, very important. But yeah, I'm just interested to see where the suspect goes, and I will be there to record and talk about the effects and all the things that'll happen after this metagame, or this mon suspect goes through. So yeah, with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a great day, and remember to take care of yourself.